You might be tempted to call him Anthony Powell. It's actually pronounced Pole, but that's beside the point. If you know him and read him, you're in a special club. If you haven't, then well, listen up. Today is your lucky day. Pole wrote one of the 20th century's great masterpieces, a 12-volume tour de force known as A Dance to the Music of Time. Begun in 1953, it concluded in 1975 and enthralled a generation of readers. The books follow a cast of British characters from public schools in the 1920s through the war and on to middle age and beyond. You fall in love with Pole because he's a master of English prose, a discreet, sympathetic psychologist, a literary man as comfortable in army garrisons as he is in privileged drawing rooms. But you read Pole in the end because he is fun to read, and you meet characters like Uncle Gills, ex-Trapnell, and the unforgettable Kenneth Widmerpool. My guest is the perfect guide for Pole and his universe. Harry Mount is the great nephew of Anthony Powell, a trustee of the Anthony Powell Society and a distinguished writer himself, authoring nearly 10 nonfiction books, including the best-selling book, Carpe Diem, Put a Little Latin in Your Life. He is also the editor of the distinctly British magazine, The Oldie. And in our age of sudden wealth and overnight fame, Mount hails from a far different world. His grandfather, Robin Mount, was a famed steeplechase jockey. His father, Sir Ferdinand Mount, has written well-reviewed novels, histories, and an excellent memoir. He was also editor at the Times Literary Supplement. And if you think writers are too isolated from practical matters, well, Ferdinand headed up Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's policy unit in the early 1980s. Not bad. And there's Harry's second cousin, David, who most people know as former Prime Minister David Cameron. Enjoy the conversation with Harry Mount. Anthony Powell died in 2000, and then in 2018, Hilary Sperling published an authorized biography of Powell. Why should we still read Powell? And is he a writer of the first rank?
I'll answer in reverse order. I would say yes, definitely a writer of the first rank. I'm biased as his great nephew. I would say read him as a great, very original stylist. You can take any number of passages and you could tell in a second it's by Powell, a particular precise form of syntax, often particular words. He's very keen on the expression not unfriendly, not unattractive, that sort of formulation. But I think the main reason is the best picture of the progress of British life of many classes and backgrounds through the early to late 20th century. I was particularly struck because I grew up knowing him as a little boy, didn't start reading them till my teens and 20s. And then as I grew older, I realized that many of the things he was saying that was happening to the main characters were then happening to my contemporaries, even though I'm 66 years younger than him. The same patterns were going on and are still going on today.
You mentioned, of course, that you are the great nephew, and obviously you knew him in the journals, which I've just recently started getting into. You are mentioned in the journals, as I'm sure you know, and he called you intriguing, which coming from a novelist with psychological insight, that's pretty cool. One of the things that comes up a lot is that he's referred to as the English Proust. And it's an interesting, almost a journalistic shorthand, I think, to help people understand him a little bit. We know that he studied a la Recherche very carefully, and that Nicholas Jenkins reads him in The Dance. I have my own thoughts on that comparison. What do you think?
Well, I'm pretty sure he said that he admired Proust and thought he was great. I don't think he did base himself on Proust. They're similar in terms of both being highly intellectual, amusing in a very gentle, dry way. But actually, there's a good point made in the latest journal of the Anthony Powell Society, which says that the Proust character in Proust gets really, really involved in a very, very emotional way with his fellow characters, whereas Nick Jenkins is brilliant at standing back at one remove. And although he's married to or related to many of the main characters, he rarely gets upset. He notices how terrible people are. He notices people being destroyed by people like the great Pamela Flitton or the dreadful Widmerpool, but he's standing at one remove. So I think the reason why the comparison was made was because of the great length of these novels, series of novels, and their brilliance. But if you look at them closely, I think they're pretty different.
Christopher Hitchens wrote a really fine review of the abridged memoir of Pohl when it came out. And in that, he actually refers to a piece that your father, Ferdy Mount, wrote. And of course, he is a distinguished writer in his own right.
Yeah.
And in this obituary, I guess you would say, your father felt the need to sort of defend this longstanding criticism that Pohl's books just focused on characters who were privileged. I've always found that argument puzzling, and Christopher Hitchens did as well. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the immediate riposte to that is to read the novels about the war, the three novels which are based on the Welsh soldiers that he fought with in the Second World War, and he is just as good on bank managers and private soldiers as he is on dukes and earls. It's certainly true that he came from a particular background, went to Eton and Oxford, married an earl's daughter, my beloved great aunt. So, of course, that's the world he moved in and knew best. But at the same time, even within the literary world, in younger life, he was very, very curious. So he was one of the first to spot the brilliance of, for example, Kingsley Amis and Philip Larkin, who were 20 years younger than him and not from an upper class background. So I think he observed what he was surrounded by and was very curious by everything he saw. Having said that, it is true, he was interested in the upper classes. He once said if there were a dictionary of plumbers, he'd have consulted it as closely as he consulted Burke's Peerage. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but he was very, very curious, and that's what led to this extremely brilliant series of observations, really, 12 novels about people of every background and every class over such a long period of time. I think the reason why the last novel in the sequence perhaps slightly misfired was because he was writing it later when he had moved away from London to Somerset, and he was writing about incidents like the arrival of the hippies in London in the 70s, which he was no longer seeing firsthand. But before that, he is writing with a bit of a time lag, but about things that he'd witnessed throughout his life, and he's pretty spot on.
I've always found the criticism kind of odd in the sense that like it's the many of the characters come from a bohemian sort of on the fringes artsy world, and I was amazed just to read about how, in terms of his finances, how kind of sketchy they were until I think when his father died, and he inherited surprisingly, quite a bit of money, and was able to use that, and so he certainly knew kind of living on the edge, and so that's always a curious criticism.
Yes, and he didn't come from a rich background. His father was an army officer, and who could afford to send him to Eton and for him to go to Oxford, but he had to earn his living, and he earned his living as a publisher before he became a literary journalist before he became a writer. And I think, again, that's a great advantage. It means that if you're working, you're seeing lots of people and you're observing figures like the brilliant ex-Trapnell, one of my favorite characters in Dance.
There was a really interesting interview with A.N. Wilson, who I know writes for the Oldie, and he did a podcast with the Times Literary Supplement, and he talked about Pohl being obsessed with the military, and I think by that he meant martial culture and as opposed to militarism. And he said that a friend related a story where he took Pohl to a dinner where there was some retired colonels, and they were blown away by Pohl's knowledge of intricate military manners. And I guess after the dinner, they went to A.N. Wilson's friend. They said, "Is he some brigadier? We've never met him." And so I thought that was interesting. But I also, from Hilary Sperling's biography, I really got the sense of what a cross being in the service was. The bureaucracy, the small-mindedness, the separation from Violet, and et cetera. Where was he on this whole military issue and his feelings about it?
Well, I think it's instrumental in his upbringing, that combined with being an only child, so he's on his own a lot, and he's moving houses quite a lot. And I think these are things which are inclined to make you an observer from a young age. And then he never told me, or I haven't read this, but I'd have thought growing up in the military world with his father, quite a senior officer, you become very interested in matters of rank, which you could say applies also to the class system as well. But he, as somebody who hasn't been in the military, and my family haven't been, I'm still not very good on the difference between a lieutenant colonel and a major and that sort of thing. He would have known those things
Yes.
inside out. I think the thing about being in the war, his books are so good at the boredom of being in the war that we're so
Yeah.
used to, if we weren't alive then, looking back at all the great battles and the great tragedies, we don't think of the years and years where nothing happens, or he's in Northern Ireland for a while where there's not much
Right.
going on, and he's really good on the waiting between jobs. I tell you, I think who's just as good as Evelyn Waugh in his war novels too. But
Yeah.
the
Yes.
dullness of military life combined with its great terror, he's really good at being honest about things and not mythologizing them. There's a brilliant bit where Nick Jenkins goes back to Oxford, where Anthony Powell had been, and where I also went, and he describes Nick Jenkins in middle age feeling, it's better than this, feeling all the gloom of the undergraduate condition all over again. Something like that. But actually, it'd be so easy to say
Yeah.
in a Brideshead Revisited sort of way, going back to Oxford, how wonderful it was, how beautiful it was, how delicious the champagne and plover's eggs were. But actually, it is quite gloomy sometimes being young, and Oxford itself, for all its beauties, does have its glooms, not least being right next to the damp river. So he's very, very honest about things.
You mentioned the war novels of Evelyn Waugh, and I think he had, in a sense, I guess, more exciting material to work with. And I think that with I think it was the invasion of Crete that didn't go off so well. But it's impressive that Pohl was able to deal with, the domestic garrison existence of a soldier, as you mentioned, and also not. I mean, of course, we have Widmer Pool is involved, and there are obviously some crotchety, rule-bound older officers, but he also doesn't mock it in a way, which again I think is a kind of
No, that's true.
subtle
I'm
talent.
a huge Evelyn Waugh fan, but Evelyn Waugh does turn up the dial of the comedy and the mocking intentionally. So it's fantastic. But Pohl's is more serious and more honest, and between them you get a brilliant picture of what it was really like.
And speaking of Evelyn Waugh, I guess one of the questions that kind of I continue to think about is I don't anecdotally I don't have a sense, at least online, which is the only literary culture I know, sadly,
Yeah,
that Pohl isn't being written about or talked about the way, say, other writers of that era are. Evelyn Waugh, I think, has a higher profile, and of course they were friends, etc. What is the current reputation, if you will, with with Powell and his contemporaries?
Well, I would say you're right that in Britain, very few people under 40 would read Anthony Powell or would even have heard of him. You occasionally come across, some brilliant person who's come across him and gets addicted like you and I have got. But he isn't nearly as famous as Evelyn Waugh. I think that's partly because they aren't filmed so much. There was the film version of Dance, which I thought was good, but was too short, so it compressed those 12 books into, I think, just 4 hours. So there are, of course, other Powell novels which could be filmed but haven't been filmed, and so he is known less. I think there's also a theory that when someone dies, a writer dies, there's a lot of interest in them immediately after they die, and then they go out of fashion for a bit, and then come back. So I'm hoping that will happen with Powell. It's also, I suppose, it's a bigger ask, isn't it, to read 12 novels? And I must say, when I started trying them as a teenager, I found the first novel quite slow going, so I gave it up and I tried again. I suppose my early 20s, got through that, and then by about halfway through the third book, I was gripped.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. To keep up with my interviews, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can also go to Substack and sign up for a free literature and geopolitics newsletter. Every week you'll get articles by me on literary taste, current affairs, and history's curious turns. Thanks again for watching.